For decades, the world believed that humanity's ascent into the skies was inevitable. Yet an entire generation of engineers watched a secret failure unfold on a cold December morning in Kitty Hawk, one that would keep powered flight out of reach for years to come. The Wright brothers' engine catastrophically seized, shattering the promise of their historic 190.03 trial and allowing entrenched industrial interests to suppress any immediate breakthrough. They profited from directing resources towards safer, ground-based inventions while the dream of soaring machines was quietly shelved. This hidden setback matters today because it rewrote the very timetable of modern warfare, commerce, and cultural exchange. The failure was not a single mishap, but a systemic inertia within early 20th century innovation circles, a network of investors, patent lawyers, and military planners who, faced with uncertainty, chose to channel funding into proven technologies rather than gamble on fragile engines. The Wrights' repeated attempts over the next decade yielded only modest gliders and stalled prototypes. Each crash reinforced a narrative that true powered flight remained an impossible fantasy. As nations marched toward industrial might, the United States surged forward, its factories humming with steel and electricity, while Europe hardened into two opposing blocs, the Triple Entente and the Central Powers. The absence of reliable aircraft left reconnaissance to balloons and observation posts perched on static poles. When Archduke Franz Ferdinand fell in June 1914, the world was poised for a conflict that would be fought almost entirely from the ground. Without airplanes to dominate the skies, both Britain and Germany turned their attention to the only viable aerial platform left, lighter than aircraft. The German Zeppelin Corps, already an elite unit within the Imperial Army, received unprecedented funding from the Reichstag, which saw airships as a means to project power without risking the unproven engine technology that had failed in America. Simultaneously, the British Royal Naval Air Service (RNAA) accelerated its balloon program, converting old naval vessels into floating observation stations and investing heavily in rigid airship construction. The American Aviation Committee, created after the war by a neutral coalition of engineers and policymakers, observed these developments with caution. Though the United States remained aloof from European entanglements, it recognized that control of the upper atmosphere could become a decisive factor in future conflicts. Yet without a domestic engine breakthrough, the committee could only fund experimental research, leaving the nation dependent on foreign designs for any serious aerial ambition. When the Great War erupted in 1914, the Western Front quickly devolved into a labyrinth of trenches stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss border. In our timeline, aircraft would soon provide vital intelligence that helped commanders adjust artillery fire and plan offensives. Here, however, reconnaissance remained tethered to balloons drifting above static lines, their observers vulnerable to enemy fire and limited by weather. The absence of fast-moving aerial scouts meant that both sides relied on painstakingly slow infantry patrols and wired telegraphy for battlefield information. The Somme offensive of 1916, already infamous for its carnage, became a prolonged stalemate. Without the ability to spot hidden enemy positions from above, artillery barrages missed their marks and infantry assaults were repeatedly repulsed. The war settled into an even grimmer deadlock than history records, with casualties mounting as each side dug deeper rather than seeking breakthroughs. Desperate for a way to break the impasse, Germany turned its massive Zeppelins towards strategic bombing. From bases in the north, sleek silver hulls rose above the clouds, carrying modest payloads of incendiary bombs aimed at London, Paris, and other civilian centers. Their silent approach at night sparked terror among populations that had never before seen a war machine glide across the sky. Yet the raids achieved little strategic effect. The Zeppelins were slow, highly vulnerable to emerging anti-aircraft artillery, and their limited range forced them to fly low over hostile territory where they were easily spotted and shot down. Moreover, the British RNAA's network of barrage balloons and early warning stations mitigated much of the damage. The psychological impact lingered. People stared at night skies with dread, but the material disruption was marginal, underscoring how an aviation lag left both sides grasping for a tool that could not yet fulfill its promise. When the Treaty of Versailles forced Germany to dismantle its airship factories and restrict aerial production, The nation's fledgling Zeppelin industry collapsed almost overnight. The Allied powers, while victorious, recognized that the war had exposed the limits of relying solely on lighter-than-air craft for modern combat. In Washington, the American Aviation Committee seized the moment to launch an ambitious program aimed at developing a high-output radial engine capable of sustaining powered flight. Funding flowed from both private industrialists who saw post-war commercial potential and from the government, which feared that future conflicts would again be decided by who could dominate the skies first. The committee partnered with British engineers from the RNAA, sharing data on materials and aerodynamics, while keeping the project insulated from the political turbulence that still roiled Europe after 1919. By the spring of 1922, a collaborative team of American and British designers unveiled a prototype aircraft powered by a newly forged radial engine capable of delivering sustained thrust for over an hour. On a misty morning at Langley Field, the machine lifted off, its wooden wings trembling but holding steady as it climbed above the surrounding fields, a moment that would be recorded in sparse laboratory journals but never celebrated on a world stage. The flight proved that reliable powered aviation was finally within reach, yet it arrived more than 15 years after the original Wright triumph had been expected. Military strategists, still haunted by the lessons of trench warfare, began to rewrite doctrines, integrating aircraft as reconnaissance assets first and then as potential bombers. The delay meant that the interwar period saw a slower evolution of air power. Strategic bombing theories remained theoretical for longer, and transport aviation developed at a modest pace. When World War I erupted in 1939, the world's air forces were still catching up to concepts that had been fully formed in our timeline decades earlier. The United States, now possessing a fledgling fleet of radial engine aircraft, fielded planes that could support ground troops but lacked the range and payload capacity for deep strategic bombing campaigns. Germany, constrained by Versailles' lingering restrictions, relied heavily on captured foreign designs and limited production of its own fighters. The result was a conflict where air superiority played a secondary role to land and naval battles. The Blitzkrieg's famed rapid advances were blunted. Without a robust bomber force to cripple enemy infrastructure early, campaigns unfolded over longer periods, extending the war's duration. Logistics suffered as well. Without established cargo aircraft, moving troops and supplies across continents depended on ships that could be intercepted by submarines, further complicating strategic planning. Commercial air travel, which in our world took off in the late 1920s with passenger routes linking New York to Paris, did not become a viable industry until the early 1950s. The delayed engine breakthroughs meant that reliable, safe aircraft were scarce and expensive. As a result, global mobility grew at roughly half the speed of historical reality. Business executives still relied on transatlantic steamships. Immigrants faced longer journeys, shaping demographic patterns that favored regional migration over distant relocation. The slower diffusion of ideas and capital contributed to a post-war economy that remained more localized. Nations with extensive rail networks, particularly in Europe and North America, maintained their economic dominance, while regions dependent on maritime trade struggled to integrate into the emerging global market. Cultural exchange lagged. Music, film, and literature traveled slower, preserving distinct regional identities well into the second half of the 20th century. The divergence that began with a single engine failure in 1903 rippled through every facet of modern life. It illustrates how technological milestones are not isolated events, but threads woven into the fabric of politics, warfare, and society. The world we know, a sky crisscrossed by jets, cities linked by rapid air routes, conflicts shaped by aerial dominance, might have unfolded differently if that first powered flight had never taken off. In reflecting on this alternate path, we are reminded that progress often hinges on fragile moments of success or failure. When those moments tilt toward loss, entire eras can be reshaped, leaving us to wonder how many other hidden setbacks lie beneath the surface of our own history, waiting to be uncovered.